The water was wrong. Kael felt it before she understood it, a pressure change in the current that rolled across the scarred plates of her dorsal ridge like a hand pressing the wrong way. She was deep, 40 meters below the surface of the Athran shelf, where the ocean floor dropped into a canyon so dark that even her lateral sensors couldn't map the bottom. Her body 9 meters of hydrodynamic muscle sheathed in interlocking plates of bite, the ceramic-dense bone composite that made her species the undisputed apex of every ocean they'd ever entered flexed against the shift and held. Something was hunting. Not her. Nothing hunted a kaelvren. Not on this world, not on the 7 others where the Galactic Accord had documented her species before the purge fleets arrived. But something was hunting nearby, and whatever it was chasing was small and moving wrong, too slow, too loud, too close to the surface. Kael turned. The lateral line that ran the length of her body from the scarred stump of her right pectoral fin to the base of her tail flukes registered the pressure signature of the prey, a single body bipedal displacement pattern sinking, not swimming, sinking. She'd been in the containment net for 6 years before she'd learned what that pattern meant, a land creature in water, drowning. The hunters were kaelvren deep-shelf pack predators with needle teeth and coordinated attack patterns that the Accord classified as a moderate hazard. Moderate. Kael had killed 14 of them in the containment zone when they'd slipped through the perimeter nets on a spring tide, and the Accord wardens had added it to her file under aggression incidents, as though she'd done something wrong, as though she should have let them eat the maintenance drone. There were 6 kaelvren now. She could feel them, each one a tight knot of vibration in the water, fast and focused, circling something 30 meters above her and 20 meters to her left. And between them, sinking, the small body that moved like it had never been in deep water before. Kael didn't think about what she did next. Thinking was what the Accord scientists had spent years trying to measure with their electrode arrays and stimulus tests, and carefully calibrated reward protocols, the ones that always ended with her slamming her body against the containment barrier until the monitoring equipment shattered and the wardens evacuated the observation deck. Thinking was what they wrote about in their reports, demonstrates problem-solving capacity consistent with Class 8 cognitive baseline, as though the ability to think was a threat level. She moved. 9 meters of kaelvren, rising through 40 meters of dark water like a ballistic round fired from the canyon floor. Her plates locked into attack configuration, dorsal ridge flared, bait plating sealed along her flanks, jaw mechanism cycling to full extension. The kaelvren felt her coming. She knew because 3 of them broke formation and scattered before she was halfway there, their needle-toothed bodies corkscrewing away into the deep shelf, with the particular urgency of animals that had just realized they were no longer at the top of the food chain. The other 3 didn't scatter fast enough. Kael hit the nearest one at full velocity. Her jaw closed around its midsection with the force of a hull press, and the kaelvren folded. She released it dead or dying. It didn't matter, and caught the second one with her tail as it tried to dive past her. The impact sent it tumbling into the darkness. The third one was already running, but it had been too close to the sinking body, and Kael put herself between them with a roll that sent a pressure wave rippling across the shelf. The kaelvren flinched sideways, found open water, and vanished. 6 seconds. 6 kaelvren scattered, 2 destroyed, 1 crippled. The water around her tasted like iron and fear. And the small body was still sinking. Kael turned and found it. A bipedal landwalker, surface breather, no gills, no swim bladder, no thermal regulation visible in the water. Small. Very small. Kael's lateral line measured it at roughly 1.4 meters, less than a sixth of her own body length. It was wrapped in some kind of fabric that had gone heavy with water and was dragging it down, and its limbs were moving in the uncoordinated way that meant it was running out of air. She knew what it was. She'd seen them on the observation deck of the containment zone, the wardens, the scientists, the occasional Accord official who came to inspect the facility where they kept the last 3 kaelvren in custody. Bipeds, soft-skinned. They walked on 2 legs and breathed air and pointed instruments at her through the observation glass and wrote things down. But this one was different. This one was smaller than any she'd seen, and it wasn't pointing anything. It was drowning. Kael descended to match its depth. The small body had stopped struggling, the worst sign, the one that meant the drowning process was nearly complete. Its eyes were open, though. Round eyes, dark, too large for the face. They found Kael in the murky water and went wide, and for a moment the creature's entire body tensed with something. Kael's lateral line red as a spike of raw terror. She was, after all, 9 meters of armored oceanic apex predator with blood on her jaw and a dorsal ridge that could slice through ship plating. She understood the reaction. But she didn't leave. Instead, she did something that no kaelvren in the Accord's behavioral database had ever been documented doing. She angled her body beneath the sinking biped, brought the broad, flat section of her back, the only part of her that wasn't edged or plated or dangerous, under its body, and rose. The small creature hit her back and grabbed. Tiny hands, desperate grip, fingers wrapping around the leading edge of her dorsal ridge with a strength that surprised her. Kael felt the contact through her plates warm. Land creature warm. A heat signature that cut through the cold shelf water like a current from a thermal vent. She surfaced. The air hit her dorsal sensors and the biped's body convulsed with the first real breath, a sound like something tearing, followed by coughing that shook its entire frame. It didn't let go of her ridge. It held on with both hands, face pressed against the ceramic surface of her back, and breathed. Just breathed. Kael floated. Her tail moved in slow sweeps to hold position against the current, and her lateral line tracked the biped's vitals through the contact point's heartbeat, slowing from crisis to elevated, body temperature stabilizing, respiratory patterns shifting from emergency gasps to something that approached rhythm. The creature was recovering. Around them the ocean was empty, the kaelvren were gone. The shelf stretched in every direction, dark water under a sky that Kael had seen only 3 times since her capture, twice during transport, and once during a containment breach that she'd engineered deliberately, knowing the consequence would be another 18 months of isolation protocols. She didn't know where she was. That was the strange part. She knew the water, every current, every thermal layer, every pressure gradient within 100 kilometers of the Athran shelf, but she didn't know how she'd gotten out of containment. The last thing she remembered before the water went wrong was the sound of an explosion, deep and structural, the kind that meant something large had broken. Then the containment barrier had buckled, and the ocean had flooded through, and she'd swum. 3 hours ago, maybe 4. She'd been swimming since, following the deep channel away from the facility, away from the electrode arrays and the stimulus tests and the observation glass, away from the 2 other kaelvren who shared her prison. Voss, the old bull who hadn't moved from the bottom of his enclosure in 2 years, and Senth, the juvenile female who still flinched at the feeding chute. She thought about them sometimes. Voss, who had been wild-caught 18 years ago and had spent the first decade breaking everything they put in front of him, until something inside him broke instead. And now he lay on the floor of his enclosure with his plates unlocked, and his lateral line barely registering, and his heartbeat so slow that the monitors periodically flagged it as a flatline event. Senth, who had been born in containment, who had never felt open water or hunted live prey or heard another kaelvren's resonance outside the muffled vibrations that leaked through 2 meters of barrier wall. Senth, who was 4 years old and should have been learning the migration corridors from her mother, and instead she cowered when the feeding chute activated, because the sound it made was similar to the sound of the sedation launcher. Kael had tried. Through the barriers, through the walls, she had pushed her resonance toward them, the deep-frequency carrier wave that kaelvren used to communicate across oceanic distances, the one that could propagate through bedrock and hull plating and the composite walls of a containment facility if you pushed hard enough. She'd sent it to Voss every night for 3 years. I'm here, wake up. He hadn't answered. She'd sent it to Synth whenever the juvenile panicked. Calm, steady, the sound a mother makes when the water is dark and the cub is afraid. Synth had answered once. A thin, reedy note that barely carried through the wall. Then the wardens had increased the acoustic dampening on Kael's enclosure, and even that thread had gone silent. The explosion that freed her had been structural. A seismic event, the wardens would later determine, a fault line shift beneath the facility's foundation that had buckled 3 containment barriers and flooded the lower enclosures. Kael's barrier had been the first to fail. She'd felt the crack propagate through the BH-reinforced composite, and she'd hit it with everything she had. 9 meters of muscle driving her skull into the fracture line, until the wall gave way and the ocean poured through. She hadn't waited. She should have turned back, should have found the breaches in Voss's and Synth's enclosures and shepherded them through. But the open water had hit her lateral line like a drug, and her body had done what 6 years of captivity had been preventing it from doing. It had moved. Full velocity, no walls, no barriers, no electrodes, just the deep channel stretching ahead of her into the dark water of the Athran Shelf, and she had run. The guilt sat in her like a stone, heavier than the tracking implant, heavier than the scars. She'd left them, the old bull and the frightened cub, still in their boxes, and she'd swum. She'd been swimming toward nothing in particular. She hadn't had a destination in 6 years. Kaelvren were migratory, her species crossed oceans the way some creatures crossed fields, following thermal corridors and prey migrations, and the deep electromagnetic currents that mapped the planet's core. Before her capture, Kael had never stayed in one place for more than a lunar cycle. 6 years in a box the size of a cargo bay. The biped coughed again, smaller this time. Its grip on her ridge shifted, and Kael felt it move, pulling itself higher on her back, settling its body against the curve of her spine in a way that seemed almost deliberate. As though it had decided that the 9-meter predator beneath it was not the most dangerous thing in the ocean. Kael turned her head enough to see it with her left eye. The biped was looking at her. Those 2 large dark eyes, fixed on the curve of her skull, on the scarred plates of her jaw, on the blood still dissolving off her teeth from the kaelvren. It should have been terrified. Every biped Kael had ever encountered had been terrified of her, the wardens with their sedation lances and containment protocols. The scientists who wouldn't enter her enclosure without 3 barrier layers between them. The Accord inspector who had recommended termination when Kael had broken the observation glass by ramming it with her skull. This one wasn't terrified. Or rather, it had been terrified, and then it had decided not to be. Kael could feel the difference through her lateral line. The fear was still there, a steady low-frequency vibration in the creature's body, but it was being overridden by something else, something that read like a deliberate act of trust. The biped released one hand from her ridge and extended it slowly toward the scarred plates of her skull. Small fingers, pruning from the water, trembling slightly. They touched the bait plating above her left eye, the thinnest point, the place where the plates were still cracked from the containment ram 3 years ago that had earned her a month of isolation and an additional notation in her aggression file. The touch was gentle. So gentle that Kael's threat response system didn't even register it as contact. It registered as something else, something her behavioral cortex had no classification for, because no living thing had touched her like that since her mother had groomed her plates in the deep waters of the Vashon Trench 12 years ago, before the purge fleet came and the nets closed, and the world narrowed to the dimensions of a box. Kael closed her eye. The membrane slid across the lens and the world went dark, and the small warm hand stayed where it was. Something happened in her brain. Not the electrode measurable kind, not the stimulus response pattern that the Accord scientists would have recognized and cataloged. Something older. Something that predated the neural architecture the scientists had mapped, and the behavioral baselines they'd established, and the aggression indices they'd built their termination recommendations on. Something that lived in the part of a kaelvren that was not cognitive, not calculable, not classifiable. Recognition. This small creature had been drowning. Kael had saved it, and instead of screaming, instead of stabbing her with a sedation lance, instead of pointing an instrument at her and writing things down, it had put its hand on the broken part of her skull and held it there. In the deep behavioral architecture of a kaelvren, the part that the Accord had never mapped, because they'd never been willing to stop measuring long enough to listen, that meant something absolute. Peck. Kael opened her eye. The biped was still there, still touching her, still breathing. Its dark eyes were wet from the ocean or from something else. It opened its mouth and made a sound. Kael's auditory system wasn't calibrated for atmospheric speech, but she caught the vibration through the water layer on her plates, a pattern repeated, short syllables. It was saying something. She didn't understand the words. She understood the tone. It was the tone of a creature that was small and scared and had just decided to trust something that could kill it with a thought. Kael moved. Slowly, carefully, in a way she had never moved in the containment zone because there had never been a reason to be careful. She brought her body around in a gentle arc, keeping her back level so the biped wouldn't slide, and began swimming toward the shoreline she could feel through the thermal gradient a kilometer to the east. The biped's hands tightened on her ridge, and its body pressed flatter against her back, and Kael matched her pace to the creature's comfort, gliding through the surface layer at a speed that barely raised a wake. She was halfway to the shore when her lateral line picked up the first vibration. Not kaelvren, not anything organic. A mechanical signature, engines, heavy ones, the kind that the containment facility used on its pursuit boats. 3 sources converging from the north, moving fast. The Accord was coming. Kael's plates locked. Her dorsal ridge flared, and the biped on her back made a startled sound as the ceramic edges rose around it like a wall. Not to threaten the creature, to shield it. The ridge configuration that the Accord classified as maximum aggression display was, in the behavioral vocabulary of a kaelvren, something entirely different. It was the configuration a mother used to protect her young during a deep-water attack. The first boat appeared on the surface 400 meters out, a gray hull with the Accord's containment division markings, armed with 2 deck-mounted sedation launchers and a hull-mounted sonar array that Kael could feel pulsing through the water like a headache. 2 more boats flanked it, smaller, faster, running parallel courses that bracketed her position. They'd found her. Of course they'd found her. The tracking implant in her left pectoral stump, the one they'd installed after amputating the fin she damaged during her 3rd escape attempt, had been broadcasting her position since the moment she'd cleared the facility perimeter. Kael dove. Not deep, just enough to submerge to get the biped's head below the surface for a moment before she brought it back up. The creature gasped and choked, and Kael felt its grip on her ridge shift from trust to panic, and she surfaced immediately, leveling her back, steadying her body. An apology she couldn't articulate. She hadn't been trying to drown it. She'd been trying to get below the sonar pulse. The biped coughed water and pressed its face against her ridge. Its fingers didn't let go. A voice crackled across the water, amplified, harsh, carrying the particular cadence of someone who was used to giving orders to things that couldn't argue back. Kael's auditory system translated the atmospheric vibrations into approximate meaning. Commands, threats, the word organism used the way you'd say weapon or hazard. She'd heard it all before. She'd been hearing it for 6 years. Attention, unauthorized personnel. You are in physical contact with a Accord-classified apex organism, AK-7. Remove yourself from the organism immediately. This is a direct order under Containment Directive 1140. Failure to comply will result in forcible extraction. The biped didn't move. Its hand stayed on Kael's ridge, its body stayed pressed to her back, and it turned its head toward the approaching boats with an expression that Kael couldn't read through the water but could feel through the vibration of its body. It wasn't compliance. It was something closer to defiance. Then it did something extraordinary. It shifted its weight, pulled itself higher on Kael's back, and wrapped both arms around the base of her dorsal ridge. Not gripping for survival, holding. The way you'd hold something you decided not to let go of, regardless of what was coming. And it spoke again, louder this time, directed at the boats, a voice that was too young, too small, too thin to carry authority, and yet it carried. Kael felt the words vibrate through her plates, and even without understanding the language, she understood the meaning. No. Kael's lateral line mapped the boat's positions, closing from 3 directions, 200 meters and tightening. The lead boat's sedation launcher was cycling. She could feel the pneumatic charge building through the water. They were going to tranquilize her. Standard protocol for a containment breach with a civilian at risk. Dart her, drag her back, put her in the box. Add another incident to the file. The biped would be removed, debriefed, treated for trauma exposure. She'd never see it again. She'd never see any of them again. That was what containment meant. A box forever, until the aggression indices reached the threshold and the termination order came through, and then a box of a different kind. Kael looked at the biped on her back, felt the warmth of its body, the trust in its grip, the steady heartbeat pulsing through the contact points on her ridge. 6 years in containment, and nothing had ever felt like this. No electrode test, no stimulus reward, no behavioral enrichment protocol had ever made her feel what she felt right now, the weight of something small and warm choosing to stay, even when leaving would have been the rational, safe, survival-optimized thing to do. This creature wasn't rational, it wasn't safe. It was doing the thing that nothing in the Accord's behavioral models predicted. It was choosing to stay with the predator. And the predator was choosing back. Kael dove. Deep this time, committed. She felt the biped's arms clamped tight around her ridge and pressed her back flat to give it a stable platform. The water closed over them, and she drove her tail in hard, powerful strokes that sent them arrowing down through the thermocline toward the dark water of the mid-shelf. The biped's heartbeat spiked. It was an air breather, and she was taking it under, and every instinct in its body had to be screaming to let go and surface. It didn't let go. Kael leveled off at 15 meters and ran south along the shelf edge, below the sonar ceiling of the pursuit boats, faster than they could track without their deep-water arrays. She could feel the boats above her, circling, their engines churning the surface, their sonar pulses bouncing off the thermal layers without finding her. The tracking implant was still broadcasting, but the deep water distorted the signal, scattered it across the thermal gradients in a way that would give them a general area but not a precise fix. She had 90 seconds of air for the biped, maybe less. She counted them. Lateral line tracking the creature's oxygen saturation through the subtle changes in its heartbeat, the deceleration that came with oxygen debt, the compensatory increase in blood pressure, the early stages of respiratory distress. She'd learned these patterns in containment, watching the maintenance divers who occasionally entered her enclosure to repair equipment. She knew how long a biped could hold its breath. At 60 seconds, she surfaced. They came up in a channel between 2 rock formations that jutted from the shelf edge, a narrow gap where the current was strong and the pursuit boats couldn't follow without risking their hulls on the submerged basalt. Kael held position in the channel, and the biped broke the surface with a gasp that sounded like it was born with that breath, like every breath before it had been practiced for this one. It coughed, choked, gasped again, and then Kael felt it through her plates. It laughed, a small, broken, utterly unpredictable sound, a sound that no creature in mortal danger should have been making, a sound that made Kael's lateral line spike with something she had no classification for, because joy was not an emotion that the Accord's behavioral assessment framework included in a kaelvren's repertoire. The biped was laughing because it was alive, because it was free, in the open water, with nothing between it and the sky except the creature that had saved it. Because the 9-meter apex predator that every containment protocol in the galaxy classified as a lethal hazard had just carried it away from the people who were supposed to be its protectors. Kael felt the laughter through her body like a current, and something shifted in her, something final. Something moved in the deep water below. Kael's lateral line caught it before her conscious mind did a vibration pattern she recognized. Kaelvren, not the same 6. A different group, larger, drawn by the blood she'd left in the water an hour ago. Pack predators followed blood trails the way land creatures followed smoke, not out of hunger necessarily, but out of the opportunistic calculation that where there was blood, there might be something weak enough to finish. 8 of them, rising from the canyon floor in a loose formation, their needle-tooth silhouettes registering as a constellation of fast-moving pressure points against the deeper darkness. They hadn't seen Kael yet. They were tracking the blood trail toward the channel, toward the rock formations, toward the surface where a small, warm body was sitting on the back of something they hadn't identified. Kael went still. The child felt the change, the sudden cessation of the slow tail sweeps that had been holding them in position. Its hands tightened on her ridge, and Kael felt the spike of alarm in its heartbeat, the primate instinct that understood what stillness meant in a predator. The kaelvren crested the shelf edge. The lead one, bigger than the others, a dominant female with scars across her needle nose, registered Kael's thermal signature and stopped. 8 bodies behind her accordioned into a tight cluster, their formation collapsing from hunt mode to assessment mode in the space of a second. They knew what she was. Every predator on this shelf knew what a kaelvren was. The question was whether hunger outweighed the knowledge. The dominant female made her calculation. Kael felt it, the slight forward shift in the kaelvren's center of mass, the muscle tension that preceded an attack lunge, the decision forming in the predator's body before it reached its brain. The kaelvren had decided that the blood trail was worth the risk. That the small, warm body on the surface was worth challenging a kaelvren for. Kael answered the calculation. She didn't dive, didn't charge. She simply opened her jaw, a slow, deliberate extension of the bone plates that protected her mouth, revealing the triple row of crushing teeth and the deeper row of piercing teeth behind them, each one as long as a kaelvren's skull. And she pulsed her resonance, not the soft frequency she'd made for the child, but the other one, the war frequency. The one that kaelvren used to claim territorial rights over an oceanic shelf, the one that could shatter the swim bladders of lesser predators at close range. It hit the kaelvren like a wall. The dominant female flinched so hard her body jackknifed, and the 8 pack members behind her scattered, not in the controlled retreat of a tactical withdrawal, but in the blind, thrashing panic of animals whose nervous systems had just been informed, at a frequency below conscious thought, that they were in the presence of something that operated on a different tier of existence entirely. They were gone in 4 seconds. The shelf went silent. The blood trail no longer mattered. On her back, the child's grip had loosened. Not from fear, Kael could feel the difference now, the way the child's body had gone from rigid alarm to something softer, something almost relaxed. It had watched. It had seen the kaelvren come, and it had seen Kael's jaw open, and it had felt the war frequency roll through the water, and it had understood. Safe, the child was safe, because the creature beneath it was the thing that other predators ran from. The child's hand found the cracked plates again, a touch that said simply, "I know what you are, I'm still here." The pursuit boats found them again within minutes, 3 hulls converging on the channel entrance, blocking the open water to the north. A 4th had appeared from somewhere larger, with the deep water capability to follow Kael into the shelf channels. On its deck, Figures moved with the purposeful efficiency of a containment team deploying for a forced retrieval. Kael could see them now, through the surface layer, with the part of her visual system that worked in atmospheric light. Tall bipeds in armored suits Dreth, the aquatic specialist security species that the Accord contracted for oceanic containment operations. 4 of them on the large boat, 2 on each of the flanking hulls. Sedation launchers, cable rigs, the heavy gauntlets that she recognized from her initial capture, the ones that delivered electrical pulses through the water strong enough to lock a kaelvren's muscular system into paralysis. And among them, standing at the rail of the lead boat, a figure that wasn't Dreth. Smaller, unarmored, wearing the white lab coat that Kael associated with the containment facility's research division. Dr. Torin Vise, she recognized his thermal signature, the way his body ran 2 degrees cooler than the other bipeds, the particular cadence of his heartbeat that she'd memorized through 6 years of being his subject. He was the facility's lead researcher. He was the one who designed the electrode protocols and the stimulus tests and the behavioral assessment framework. He was the one who'd written, in his last quarterly report, that AK-7 had reached terminal aggression threshold and recommended scheduled termination. He was the one who had decided she was too dangerous to live. His voice came across the water, smaller than the containment team's commands, but somehow sharper. AK-7 has a civilian on its dorsal surface. We cannot deploy the electrical deterrence without risking the civilian. Switch to targeted sedation, dorsal approach. I want a clean shot into the exposed tissue behind the 3rd ridge plate. He knew her body. He knew exactly where the plates were thinnest, where the bite gave way to muscle tissue that a sedation dart could penetrate. He'd spent 6 years studying her, measuring her, cataloging every vulnerability. The biped on her back heard the voice too. Its body went rigid, and Kael felt a new vibration through the contact points, not fear, not defiance. Anger. The small creature was angry. It sat up on her back. Kael felt the shift in weight as it straightened, releasing one arm from her ridge and holding the other hand out toward the boats, palm flat, in a gesture that Kael's auditory system couldn't interpret, but her lateral line read perfectly. Stop. The gesture of a creature drawing a line. A new voice from the lead boat. Not Torin, not the containment team. A different species, the lighter vocal pattern of a biped that Kael had never heard before. A female voice, high and tight with what sounded like controlled fury. That is my daughter. If anyone fires a dart near my child, I will have this entire operation shut down before you can reload. Ren, honey, can you hear me? Are you hurt? Daughter young. The biped on Kael's back, Ren, that was the sound pattern. The name was someone's offspring, a juvenile of whatever species it belonged to. Kael had assumed it was small for its kind, but she hadn't considered this possibility, that it was young, that it was a cub. Kael's ridge plates locked into full protective configuration. Every plate, every edge, every serrated surface that the Accord classified as a weapons system, all of it oriented outward, away from the creature on her back, forming a ceramic wall around the small body that no sedation dart could penetrate. The crew on the lead boat went still. She could feel it through the water, the abrupt cessation of purposeful movement. The collective held breath of 12 armed professionals who had just watched a classified apex predator's maximum threat display reconfigure itself into something they had never seen and had no protocol for. Protection. Kael knew what she looked like from the outside. She'd seen herself on the observation monitors, reflected in the containment glass 9 meters of plated predator, scars across her skull and flank, a jaw that could crush the hull of a patrol boat, a body that the Galactic Accord had spent billions of credits trying to keep imprisoned. From the outside, she was everything they said she was. A weapon, a hazard. An extinction-level organism that had killed 43 sentient beings across 4 containment incidents, and one attempted termination. But from the inside, from the place where she could feel the small, warm body pressed against her spine, the heartbeat that had chosen to stay, the hands that had touched her broken plates with a gentleness she hadn't felt in 12 years from there, she was something else entirely. She was a mother, not biologically, not by any metric the Accord would recognize, but in the deep architecture of a kaelvren where recognition worked and language didn't, the classification was absolute. This cub had been drowning. She had saved it. It had touched her scars and chosen to stay. By every law that governed her species, laws older than the Accord, older than the containment protocols, older than the purge fleets that had reduced her kind to 3 caged specimens, this creature was hers to protect. And she would protect it from everything, including the people who thought they owned her. Ren the child was talking again. Kael couldn't understand the words, but she could feel the pattern. Short bursts directed at the boats, then longer, softer sounds directed at her. The child's hand was on her skull again, touching the cracked plates, and Kael heard her own body make a sound she hadn't made since she was a juvenile herself, swimming alongside her mother in the deep trench. A low, rolling resonance that vibrated through her chest cavity and out through the water in concentric waves, the kaelvren equivalent of a purr. On the lead boat, Dr. Torin Vise was staring at his monitoring equipment with the expression of someone whose entire model of reality had just inverted. His instruments were picking up the resonance they had to be, because kaelvren chest resonance was powerful enough to register on seismic equipment. And whatever he was seeing on his readouts was not consistent with the behavioral profile of a terminally aggressive apex organism. "That's impossible," she heard him say, his voice thinner now. AK-7's aggression index has been at 93 for 2 consecutive assessment periods. It doesn't. That frequency. That's a bonding resonance. That's a pack recognition frequency. It hasn't produced that frequency in 6 years of monitoring. Because no one had given her a reason to. The female voice again, Ren's mother. "I can see my daughter's face. She is calm. She is touching that creature's head and it is letting her. Your apex organism is keeping my child safe. If you deploy any weapon system near them, I swear on every authority I have, and I have a considerable number of them, that every person on every one of these boats will answer for it." A silence. The boats held position, engines idling. The containment team stood at their stations with their weapons aimed, and their fingers very carefully not on the triggers. Dr. Torin was staring at his readouts, his thermal signature running 3 degrees colder than normal, the Dreth physiological equivalent of going white. Kael waited. She held her position in the channel, ridge plates locked, the child warm on her back, the purr rolling through her body in waves that she couldn't have stopped if she'd wanted to. She didn't want to. She wanted to swim to take the child south along the shelf to the deep water where no boat could follow, to find a cove where the water was warm and the current was gentle, and nothing with a sedation launcher or an aggression index could reach them. But the child needed air. The child needed land. The child needed its mother. And Kael understood, with the part of her that was not weapon and not hazard and not organism, the part of her that was simply a creature that had lived in a box for 6 years and had finally found something worth leaving it for, that protecting the child meant returning it. She began to move, slowly, keeping her back level, her ridge plates still locked in the protective configuration that had frozen the containment team mid-deployment. She swam toward the lead boat, and every biped on every hull raised their weapons or stiffened or stepped back, and Kael ignored all of them. She swam until her nose was 3 meters from the lead boat's hull, close enough that the Dreth containment officers could see the blood still drying on her jaw. Close enough that Dr. Torin could see her left eye, the one that wasn't scarred, the one that still worked in atmospheric light, looking directly at him. She saw him flinch. Good. Then she rotated, gently, bringing her back alongside the boat's hull. The child understood before anyone else did. It stood on Kael's back wobbling, soaked, impossibly small against the ocean, and reached for the rail of the boat. Hands caught it. Human hands, Kael would learn later, the mother's hands, pulling the child up and over the rail and crushing it against her chest with a sound that needed no translation. Kael watched the child disappear over the rail. She felt the loss of contact like the severance of a current, the warm weight lifting off her back, the heartbeat fading from her sensors, the small hands releasing her ridge for the last time. On the deck of the boat, the child Wren, wet and shaking, wrapped in her mother's arms, looked back at Kael over the rail. Their eyes met. Dark biped eyes and the single amber eye of a kaelvren, separated by 2 meters of air and 6 years of containment protocols, and an entire galactic classification system that said they should not be doing what they were doing. The child reached one hand over the rail, palm flat, the same gesture it had made underwater when it had touched her broken plates. Kael rose in the water until her skull was level with the rail. She pressed her forehead the cracked plates, the thin bite, the place where no warden or scientist or containment officer had ever touched her, against the child's hand. The contact lasted 4 seconds. The child's fingers spread across her plates, tracing the cracks, the scars, the damage that 6 years of captivity had written on her skull. Kael's eye closed. The resonance deepened. On the deck, no one moved. The Dreth containment team stood with their weapons lowered, their professional detachment visibly cracking. 2 of them had removed their helmets, which Kael's lateral line registered as a Dreth gesture of respect. Dr. Torin was gripping his monitoring equipment with both hands, staring at readings that contradicted everything he'd ever written about her. The female biped, the mother, was watching. Kael could feel her thermal signature, elevated, her heartbeat rapid but controlled. She was afraid. Not of Kael, not of the 9-meter apex predator pressing its skull against her daughter's hand. She was afraid of what would happen next. "The termination order," the mother said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of someone who was accustomed to having weight. "I want it rescinded, today." Dr. Torin opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Counselor Vasic, the organism's aggression metrics. I just watched your organism save my daughter from a pack of deep-shelf predators, carry her to safety on its back, shield her from your weapons with its own body, and deliver her to me without a scratch. Does your aggression metric have a classification for that?" Torin stared at his readouts. His throat worked, producing no sound. "Does it?" Counselor Vasic's voice had not risen. It didn't need to. "No," he said, "it does not." "Then your metrics are incomplete, and an incomplete metric is not grounds for execution." Kael understood none of the words. She understood all of the tone. The child's mother was doing what mothers did, protecting her young, and in doing so, she was protecting Kael. Because the 2 things had become, in the space of an afternoon, the same thing. Wren's hand was still on her skull. The child was crying. Kael could feel the saltwater tears mixing with the ocean spray on her plates, a different salinity, a different warmth. The child pressed its forehead against her plates, the way Kael's own mother had pressed her forehead against hers in the deep trench, and made a sound that was small and fierce and unmistakable in any language. "A promise." Kael waited until the child pulled back. She held the contact as long as the child held it, and when the small hand finally lifted, she let the resonance fade slowly, the way a song ends, not stopping, but resolving. Then she sank. Her body slipped below the surface, plates unlocking, ridge settling flat, and she hung in the water 3 meters below the hull, looking up at the light. She could feel the child's heartbeat through the boat's hull, fainter now, filtered through composite and metal, but still there, still fast, still warm. Kael did not swim away. The boat stayed for 3 hours. Kael stayed longer. She hung in the water below the lead boat, her lateral line tracking the vibrations on deck, the arguments, the demands, the sound of Dr. Torin's equipment being packed away, and Counselor Vasik's voice cutting through every objection with the precision of someone who had found a cause worth her fury. The containment team didn't fire. No darts, no electrical deterrents, no cable rigs. The weapons stayed aimed and the fingers stayed off the triggers, and Kael understood that something had changed, not in her classification, not in her file, not in the Accord's assessment framework, but in the 12 armed professionals who had watched a classified predator carry a child to safety and purr while it did it. When the boats finally withdrew, they left a single drone circling at 50 meters, not a weapon, a monitor. Kael ignored it. She surfaced, took a breath of air that tasted like freedom and salt and the fading warmth of a child's hand, and dove. She didn't go far. The tracking implant was still broadcasting, and the containment facility was still there, damaged but functional, waiting for her return. But the termination order, she didn't know the words, but she knew the vibration, the particular frequency of institutional intent that she'd felt building for months. That vibration had changed. A new frequency had entered the pattern, and it carried the harmonic signature of a mother's fury and a child's hand on cracked plates. 3 days later, the drone was joined by a boat. Not a containment boat, smaller, lighter, without weapons or armored personnel. It carried 2 bipeds, the female, Counselor Vasik, and the child, Ren. Kael felt them before she saw them. The child's heartbeat was unmistakable. She'd cataloged it during the rescue, every rhythm, every variation, the way it spiked when the kaelvren had circled, and the way it steadied when Kael had risen beneath it. She would have known that heartbeat in a stadium of 10,000. She surfaced 50 meters from the boat and held there, watching. The child saw her first. Kael felt the spike in its heartbeat, not fear this time, not the terror of a drowning creature facing an apex predator. Something else. Something that ran faster and warmer than fear. The child leaned over the rail and called out. That same sound pattern, the name, Kael thought, though she had no framework for bipedal naming conventions. Not the child's name. Kael's. Ren had named her. Kael approached, slowly, as she'd learned to do in the channel, keeping her back level, her ridge flat, her jaw closed. She came alongside the boat and pressed her forehead against the hull below the rail, and the child's hand came down and found the cracked plates, and the resonance started again, deep, rolling, involuntary, the sound of a kaelvren who had found something worth its voice. Dr. Torin Vise was not on the boat. Counselor Vasik had ensured that. She stood behind her daughter with one hand on the child's shoulder, and the other holding a data pad that Kael's lateral sensors detected was recording everything: the resonance, the contact, the behavioral data that would serve as evidence in whatever political war the counselor was fighting on her behalf. Kael didn't understand politics. She understood the child's hand on her skull. She understood the warmth, the absence of instruments, the absence of threat. She understood that the child had come back. Nothing in 6 years of containment had prepared her for what that felt like. Not the isolation, not the electrode tests, not the moments of rage when she'd thrown herself against the barriers until her plates cracked. Because those were all versions of the same emotion. The fury of a creature denied its nature. This was the opposite of the box. A hand on her skull, a heartbeat she'd memorized, the open ocean in every direction, and a choice. The child had chosen to come back, and Kael chose back. The visits continued. Every 3 days, then every 2, then daily. Counselor Vasik brought Ren to the shelf in the small boat, and Kael surfaced to meet them, and the child sat at the rail with its hand on her skull, and Kael purred, and the drone circled overhead recording data that was slowly, methodically dismantling every behavioral model the Accord had built for her species. On the 9th visit, Ren brought food. Not the nutrient blocks from the containment facility's automated feeding system, something else, something that smelled different when it hit the water. The child dropped it over the rail, and Kael took it carefully, and the taste was sharp and rich and alive in a way that containment food had never been. She ate it while the child watched, and the child laughed that same broken, beautiful sound from the channel, and Kael made a sound she hadn't known she could make. A short, percussive exhalation through her plates that rattled the boat's hull and sent ripples across the surface. The kaelvren equivalent of laughter. On the 14th visit, Ren slipped over the rail into the water. Kael was there before the child's feet broke the surface. Her body came up beneath Ren's with the same motion she'd used during the rescue back flat, ridge settled, the broad, safe platform of a creature whose entire evolutionary purpose was to move through water, and the child stood on her back, waist deep in the ocean, and spread its arms, and the sound it made was not a word in any language Kael knew. It was joy, pure, uncomplicated, the kind that existed before language and classification and containment directives. The child standing on the back of the predator in the open water, under the open sky, with nothing between them and the horizon. Counselor Vasic, standing at the rail, covered her mouth with one hand. Her thermal signature spiked. Her heartbeat did something complicated that Kael's lateral line read as fear and pride and grief and love, all at once, all at the same frequency. Kael swam, slowly, gently, in a wide circle around the boat, with the child standing on her back, and the drone overhead, and the open ocean in every direction, and the box 6 years and 1,000,000 lateral line readings behind her. On the 12th visit, Ren brought something else, not food, a small hard object that the child held up to Kael's eye before dropping it into the water. Kael caught it in her jaw gently, the way she would have carried a kaelvren egg, and felt it through her plates, smooth, dense, warm from the child's body heat. She didn't know what it was, but the child's heartbeat was doing the complicated thing again, the one that mixed happiness with something heavier, and Kael understood that the object was a gift. She held it in her mouth for the rest of the visit, and when the boat left, she carried it to the seafloor and wedged it into a crevice in the basalt, in the spot where a wild kaelvren would cache a prized shell or a particularly beautiful stone. Her first possession in 6 years. On the 15th visit, the facility tried to stop them. Kael felt the containment boat before she saw it, engines running hot, weapons charging, intercepting Counselor Vasic's boat 2 kilometers from the shelf. Through the water, she caught fragments of the confrontation, voices raised, the sharp cadence of authority being exercised and counter-exercised, and then a new voice, one she hadn't heard before, invoking legal terminology that even her auditory system couldn't parse into meaning. The containment boat withdrew. Vasic's boat continued. But when the child sat on Kael's back that day, its heartbeat carried a new undertone, the frequency of a creature that understood the fight wasn't over. On the 18th visit, something happened that changed everything. Kael was floating with Ren on her back, the child asleep in the hollow between her ridge plates, when her lateral line picked up a signal she hadn't felt in months. Faint, attenuated by distance and the acoustic dampening of containment walls, but unmistakable. Zentha. The juvenile kaelvren was calling, a thin, reedy note, barely above the noise floor of the ocean, not the confident carrier wave of a healthy kaelvren, but the desperate, repetitive pulse of a frightened animal reaching for something, anything, that might answer. Kael's war frequency had carried to the facility through the ocean floor. Synth had heard it, and for the first time in months, the juvenile was answering. Kael's resonance changed. The purr deepened, broadened, took on harmonics that the child on her back couldn't hear but could feel, a vibration that ran through Kael's entire body and out through the water in every direction, aimed at the thin signal from the facility. "I'm here, I hear you, hold on." On the boat, Counselor Vasic's monitoring equipment registered the shift. She looked at the readout, then at the ocean, then at her sleeping daughter curled on the back of a creature that was simultaneously keeping a child safe and reaching across kilometers of open water to comfort another prisoner. On the 20th visit, the containment facility sent a delegation. 3 Accord officials, 2 xenobiologists, and Dr. Torin Vise, who looked like he hadn't slept since the channel. They stood on the deck of a separate boat, 200 meters out, watching through long-range optical equipment as a 12-year-old biped sat cross-legged on the back of a 9-meter apex predator, and fed it chunks of raw fish from a bucket, while the predator purred loudly enough to register on the seismic monitors at the facility. Kael felt them watching. She didn't care. She was focused on the child's heartbeat, on the rhythm of its breathing, on the way its hand rested on her ridge between bites with a casual familiarity that spoke of absolute trust. The child had stopped being afraid of her after the second visit. By the fifth, it had started falling asleep on her back, its body curled in the hollow between her ridge plates, its heartbeat slowing to the deep, even rhythm of safety. A kaelvren cub, sleeping on its mother's back. The oldest pattern in the species. The one the Accord had never seen because they'd never given any kaelvren something safe enough to sleep near. Dr. Torrens' voice carried across the water, thin and uncertain. The bonding resonance has been continuous for 14 days. AK-7's cortisol levels have dropped by 73%. Aggression markers are non-existent. These readings are consistent with a post-bonding homeostatic state that our models did not predict because, he paused, because our models were built on data collected exclusively in containment conditions. We were measuring the behavior of a prisoner, not a kaelvren. A long silence from the delegation boat. Then one of the Accord officials, a voice Kael hadn't heard before, heavy with the particular timbre of someone whose authority was institutional rather than personal, said, "What are you recommending, Dr. Vise?" Another pause. Kael felt Torrens' heartbeat through the water, elevated, erratic, the signature of a biped in the grip of something he didn't know how to process. Guilt, maybe, or the vertigo of watching your life's work become evidence of your life's error. I am recommending the termination order be permanently rescinded. I am recommending the containment classification be downgraded from Class 7 to review status, pending a complete reassessment of kaelvren behavioral capacity under non-captive conditions. I am recommending that AK-7. He stopped, started again. I am recommending that the kaelvren designated AK-7 be released from containment, permanently. A silence long enough for the current to shift. And the other two, Counselor Vasik's voice from the smaller boat. VK-3 and AK-12. The old bull who hasn't moved in 2 years and the juvenile born in a cage. What's your recommendation for them, Doctor? Torrens' thermal signature dropped. The particular vibration of a biped who had just realized that the ground beneath him extended further than he'd calculated, and every step in one direction obligated him in another. The same, he said, his voice cracked on the word. Release for all 3 surviving kaelvren. The containment program has produced no actionable data that couldn't have been obtained through non-captive observation. We were measuring the behavior of prisoners. Everything we thought we knew about kaelvren aggression was an artifact of our own methodology. On Kael's back, Wren heard the words. Kael didn't understand them, but she understood what the child's body did in response, the heartbeat spiking, the involuntary tightening of its arms around her ridge, and then the sound, the shaking sound, the one that came with the salt water that wasn't ocean running down the child's face onto her plates. The child was crying and holding her, and the resonance deepened to a frequency that Kael's body hadn't produced since she was 3 years old, swimming in the deep trench alongside her mother, before the nets and the cages and the box. The frequency of home. Kael closed her eye. She felt the child's heartbeat, steady and warm and absolutely certain, against the broken plates of her skull. She felt the open water beneath her and around her and stretching to every horizon. She felt the current running south along the shelf edge, the deep electromagnetic pull of the migration corridor that her body had ached to follow for 6 years. She pressed her forehead against the child's hand. The cracked plates, the thin bead, the place where the damage was the place where Wren always touched her, as though the broken part was the most important part, as though the scars were not evidence of failure but evidence of survival. And then her lateral line caught something. Far away, kilometers. From the direction of the facility, a vibration propagating through the deep water, through the ocean floor, through the bedrock of the shelf itself. Not mechanical, not the engines of a boat or the pulse of a sonar array. A resonance, thin, reedy, the voice of a juvenile kaelvren who had never learned to sing properly because she'd been born in a box. Synth. Behind synth's signal, deeper, slower, like a heartbeat restarting after years of silence, another resonance. Massive, damaged. The voice of an old bull who hadn't spoken in 2 years, whose lateral line had gone dormant, whose will had guttered to ash on the floor of an enclosure he'd stopped trying to break. Voss. They were in the water, both of them. The containment barriers were down, and the old bull and the frightened juvenile were swimming not in formation, not with purpose, but swimming, and their voices were reaching through the ocean toward the only kaelvren who had ever answered them through the walls. Toward Kael. Her resonance changed. It deepened past the purr, past the bonding frequency, past the war frequency, down to something older and bigger than any single emotion. The migration call. The sound a kaelvren made when the pod assembled, when the deep currents aligned, when it was time to move across the ocean as a single body. She hadn't made it in 12 years. Her mother had been the last one she'd heard it from in the trench before the nets closed. The sound filled the water like a tide. On every boat, on every monitoring device, in every set of headphones worn by every Accord official and scientist and containment officer within a kilometer, the migration call arrived not as data, not as a frequency to be measured and cataloged and filed, but as what it was. And from the north, growing stronger, came the answers, 2 voices joining hers, thin and broken and uncertain, the way a song sounds when the singers have almost forgotten how. But singing. Wren's hand tightened on her plates. The child couldn't hear the frequencies, they were below the range of biped auditory systems, but the child could feel them. Through the contact, through the vibration of Kael's body, through the water itself. The child pressed its face against her skull and held on. Kael opened her eye. She looked at the child. Dark eyes met amber, and in the space between them was everything the Accord had never measured and never would. The weight of a hand on a broken plate, the warmth of a heartbeat that chose to stay, the sound of 3 creatures remembering what it meant to be free. She was not alone. The child was on her back. The pod was coming, and the ocean stretched to every horizon, wide and dark and waiting. A creature singing, because it was no longer alone.